Okay, our last lecture. This is on the late 19th century into the 21st century. We'll cover phenomenology and its aftermath, pragmatism, the analytical tradition, and logical positivism. Let's begin with Edmund Husserl, phenomenology. If you remember Rene Descartes' dualism from our previous lecture, the mind or consciousness is a completely distinct and separate substance from the physical body and the physical world around it. This dualistic view of reality gave rise to a seriously huge philosophical problem that philosophers have been writing about and discussing since then. If the mental, which is immaterial, and the physical, which is material, are so completely distinct and separate, according to Descartes, how then do they interact? How does the mind acquire knowledge of the world? How does knowing work? Descartes couldn't really explain this. Edmund Husserl, who came much later in the 1900s, was a Cartesian, a follower of Descartes. His philosophy is an attempt to describe and make sense of the physical mental interaction. It is called phenomenology because it is the study of phenomena, the ways in which things appear to us in conscious experience. Thus, Husserl's phenomenology seeks to describe and analyze, piece by piece, the structure of consciousness as it is experienced from the first person point of view, from inside, so to speak. And the objects of consciousness are described and analyzed precisely as they are given in experience. So the first step in describing the conscious experience is what Husserl calls epoche, or bracketing, meaning suspending one's previous beliefs and assumptions about the object of the experience, and just focusing on describing how the object is presented in consciousness or to consciousness, how it's experienced. When we do this, according to Husserl, one of the things we see is that the objects out there in the physical world become objects of consciousness or objects of conscious experience via what Husserl calls intentionality. So intentionality and epoche, or bracketing, are important concepts in Husserlian phenomenology. So what is intentionality? It is aboutness. It is a property or characteristic of consciousness. Husserl says all consciousness is consciousness of something, meaning, is consciousness of, meaning it's consciousness of something. So let's take our belief that some roses are red. This belief has at least two components: the subjective, which is the mental act, and its content, that some roses are red. The subjective mental act is a particular. Each person has his or her own mental act. The content of the mental act, in this case, the proposition that roses are red, is a universal, meaning it can be had by many different mental acts at the same time. So all of us can have the belief that roses are red. So the philosophically interesting and puzzling thing about intentionality is, how is it that the mind can do this? Reach out, so to speak, and be about objects out there in the world. This question gives rise to all kinds of interesting puzzles. One of these puzzles in the area of philosophy of mind addresses the question, can we reduce intentionality to merely brain activity, the activity of neurons and neurochemicals? For instance, can we make sense of neurons and neurochemicals being true or false? This is a hotly debated issue in philosophy of mind, but we don't need to go into it here. So that's that for Husserl and his view of intentionality. Let's go on to existentialism, Jean-Paul Sartre. Sartre also was a Cartesian and a student of Husserl's. He takes Husserl's idea of consciousness and draws a distinction between what he calls unreflective consciousness, which is consciousness of objects out there in the world, and reflective consciousness, where consciousness refers to itself. Consciousness. Once we study consciousness phenomenologically, which means consciousness reflecting on consciousness, we discover the I, or the self, according to Husserl. I'm sorry, Sartre, not Husserl. Also, we see that it's consciousness that makes the world appear as a meaningful and intelligible system of distinct and interrelated things. Apart from consciousness, there is only being in itself. In other words, reality is undifferentiated, meaningless, unintelligible, superfluous. In other words, absurd. I'm not sure how serious Sartre was about this, and I don't know if anyone fully understands what he means, but I think he means something like this. Consider a table, for example. It is a table because I have chosen to use it as an instrument for the fulfillment of certain purposes, to put my books on or my dinner. In other words, I've given it a certain meaning. In other circumstances, the table might appear for my consciousness or to my consciousness as firewood or as an object to hide under. However, if one day the being of the table, or I should say, the being that is the table, appears to my consciousness no longer as a table or firewood or anything else that's intelligible, but as a massive, opaque, monstrous, some kind of frightening piece of existence, then I fully comprehend the absurdity that is existence, including my own. Thus, thrown into a meaningless and absurd world, and having a dread-inspiring kind of freedom, we are overwhelmed with anguish. How does Sartre explain anguish? Well, first, he says he finds God's non-existence very distressing, because with the disappearance of God, the possibility of finding objective values also disappears. Sartre quotes Dostoevsky, a Russian novelist who lived in the 19th century and who is considered to be the father of existentialism. And here's the quote: "If God does not exist, then everything is permitted." According to Sartre, this is the starting point of existentialism. Everything is permitted means there are no objective values out there in the world for man to discover and guide his life by. Man must create his own values for himself, and he must also realize that in making choices, he is not only choosing for himself, but he is also being a lawmaker. That is, he is choosing for all of mankind. He's saying humanity should guide itself by my actions. This heavy burden of responsibility creates anguish in man. Okay, moving on to our next philosopher, who's William James. And his philosophy is called pragmatism. James believes the following is the most important dilemma in philosophy: reconciling the claims of science on the one hand and the claims of religion and morality on the other. He begins his discussion of a possible solution of this dilemma by first introducing what he takes to be an important distinction: a certain clash of human temperaments between a tough minded and a tender minded. The tough minded have an empiricist commitment to experience, going for the facts, while the tender minded have more of a taste for rational a priori principles. These guys, the tender minded ones, are idealistic, optimistic, religious. The tough minded ones are materialists, pessimistic, and irreligious. Thus, according to James, we need a philosophy that can incorporate both approaches, the empiricist and the rationalist aspects or approaches. This is where pragmatism comes in. It shows us that science and religion are compatible and don't exclude one another. James says, when trying to find out whether a particular belief is true, we need to ask the following question: what difference would it practically make if this notion, rather than that notion, were true? If no practical difference whatever can be traced, then the alternatives mean practically the same thing, and all dispute is idle. So, for example, let's say we're trying to figure out whether human beings have free will or are causally determined by the laws of physics, chemistry, and neurobiology. According to major moral theories, ascribing human beings moral responsibility, praise, and blame assumes that they have some degree of freedom when it comes to choice. They have ultimate control. Science, on the other hand, leads us to causal determinism, since every event is explained in physical terms and the individual turns out to have no ultimate control over his or her choices. To overcome this dilemma, according to James, we ask the practical or pragmatic question: what would be the practical consequences of the scientific view? Maybe people would not be held morally responsible for their actions, since ultimately it's beyond their control. Do we want to live in such a society? The answer is probably not. Thus, we decide, because of the practical consequences, that there must be free will. Okay, so that's basically James's view. So what may be true for me based on its practical consequences may be false for you, or vice versa. What may be true for me one day may turn out to be false another day based on its practical consequences. So let's go on to our next slide. G.E. Moore, Bertrand Russell, and Martha Nussbaum. Okay, so we don't need to say much about the first two. They were both Cambridge philosophers, and they both believed that philosophy should not try to provide a broad and comprehensive metaphysical system like Aristotle's or Thomas Aquinas, but instead it should focus on analyzing certain basic concepts like mind, consciousness, matter, knowledge, causality, will, etc. Moore was known as the philosopher of common sense. He thought that the philosopher's project of trying to ground our beliefs about the existence of the world, ourselves, other minds, is misguided. In his essay, A Defense of Common Sense, he listed a bunch of propositions that he claimed we know with certainty, and that it's silly to doubt these. The book lists some of these on page 365. Bertrand Russell believed that philosophy should be subordinated to science. And because there is less risk of error in science than in philosophy. Okay, let's go on to, before we talk about Martha Nussbaum, we'll talk about logical positivists, because that's what logical positivists try to do. They try to subordinate philosophy to science. And let's see what happened. According to the logical positivist theory of truth, which is called the verificationist theory of truth, only statements that can be verified through deductive logic or direct observation can be cognitively meaningful. So here's a statement of deductive logic. All human beings are animals. Socrates is a human being. Therefore, Socrates is an animal. Because this is deductively logical, it can be verified. We can know whether it's true or false. Here's another statement. Blood is red. Can this be verified? Yes, by direct observation. So therefore it is meaningful. How about the statement, God exists? This, according to logical positivists, is a meaningless statement because it can't be verified by direct observation or through deductive logic. Same with stealing is wrong. It cannot be verified deductively or through direct observation. Therefore, it's cognitively meaningless. So what kind of statements are these? God exists, stealing is wrong. According to logical positivists, these are emotive statements. They express human emotion, and emotions can't be true or false. That's all that can be said about them. Needless to say, logical positivism is self-refuting because its definition of truth cannot be verified either deductively or by direct observation. Therefore, it's cognitively meaningless. Okay. Martha Nussbaum is probably one of the most interesting philosophers. She teaches at University of Chicago. She's a philosopher and a law professor there. And she is Aristotelian in her approach. She believes that she also believes that we should add the study of certain novels to the study of philosophical ideas in order to have a fully adequate statement of powerful ethical, political, social conceptions. So, why Aristotle? Because Aristotle begins his investigation of ethics with a couple of broad questions. How should a human being live? What is the good life? His desire to investigate and to know is not merely theoretical. It is very practical. So practical reasoning and practical wisdom, according to Aristotle, has to do with specific particular situations and circumstances. Trying to discern what is the right thing to do in ethical and political situations requires perceptions of particular circumstances and particular people. This is why Aristotle's approach is so fitting in Nussbaum's project. Thus, because so much particularity is involved in our investigation of ethical and political issues, adding the study of literature to our investigation will be a good thing. Literature speaks to us because it is about us, our lives and our choices and emotions, our social existence, and things we care about. It gives us patterns of possibilities and of circumstance and choice. So, for example, in one of her essays titled The Princess Casamassima and the Political Imagination, Nussbaum, using Henry James's novel The Princess Casamassima, sets out to investigate the idea of progress. More specifically, she asks, how can a person of compassion either kill or, after all, not kill the enemies of the people? What can the novel show us about this? First, I have to tell you a little bit about the novel. Hyacinth, the hero of the novel, is a young, sensitive, and responsive, um, young, sensitive, responsive man, and he loves, out of love and compassion for the suffering people living in the slums of London, he is on his way to becoming a revolutionary, even willing to engage in violence. He too is poor, but not direfully wretched like the others around him. The woman who took him in and raised him when he was a little child has worked faithfully and devotedly all of her life to make sure his needs are met. He hasn't gone hungry, he hasn't lived in squalor and dirt. He's received an education, and very importantly, he loves and takes pride in his work, which is bookbinding. Thus, it is not alienating work. He takes pride in his creations as expressions of his thoughts and feelings. And in addition, his work leaves him enough time to make friends and be socially involved. By tracing the evolution of Hyacinth's views and contrasting Hyacinth with other revolutionaries, and highlighting the salient features in their characters and particular situations, Nussbaum gives us what she considers to be the three essential elements of politics. First, socialism in the economy. She says, quote, the novel clearly shows us that the provision to all of basic needs of life, including food, housing, recreational space, decent healthcare, education, is an essential part of any society that would have any chance of confronting and dealing with the wrongs and injustices that face its people. Close quote. The second key element in politics, as the novel shows us, according to Nussbaum, is liberalism. It shows us that essential to human dignity is the free and responsive activity of thought and speech. And it sets before our eyes revolutionary socialism as a prison for the spirit, as pernicious as the prison of poverty, as long as it encroaches upon and violates the liberties of thought and speech. For instance, in contrast to Hyacinth, who has an acute sense of the value and dignity of individual human beings, the two revolutionary leaders in the novel seem to be deficient in their perception and awareness of individual human beings, even though they are surrounded by them. They are passionate about justice and change, but humanity remains an abstraction for them, never really a matter of particular individuals or persons. For them, the woes of humanity are primarily matters of clear and dry statistics. James's point, says Nussbaum, is that in rising above individual human beings, quote, politics becomes capable of atrocity and ceases to breathe the human air, close quote. So what does the novel advocate in place of revolutionary violence? According to Nussbaum, it doesn't advocate complacency and resignation, passive acceptance of injustices here and now while we wait for a new creation to sweep it all away. Instead, it advocates for patient struggle for change through active and emotional engagement, but without anger and violence. And lastly, the third element, respect for and conservation of cultural treasures in literature, music, and art. These are what give people their identity. Take away these, and the fabric of civilization is destroyed. This last insight makes me think of the former Soviet Union, where I grew up. For many years, under Soviet communism, certain books were banned, and these were books written by Russian writers, Fyodor Dostoevsky, Leo Tolstoy, Alexander Solzhenitsyn. The first two probably because they were religious writers mostly, and the third because he was explicitly critical of the state. But I think Nussbaum's insight, at least this last, the third element, is a good one. Okay, I think that was a very short, brief summary of her argument, presented in her very interesting essay on Henry James's novel and the political imagination. But I think it gives you a good understanding of her writing style and her interest, what she likes to talk about and think about. So that she is our last philosopher. I hope this was helpful, and have a good weekend.